He's thinking I'm automatically dooming our relationship by talking about a prenup.
Did you ever take into consideration that he packed his whole life up to move here?
I don't care her stuff.
It's not that she's planning for a future divorce. She's just protecting herself. And I'm going to be honest, I'm the one who suggested it in the first place.
They have valid points, but at the end of the day, they're not in my shoes and they didn't go through half of the things that I went through. So honestly, their opinions really don't matter.
My side say and my heart say, you are not bad.
Yeah.
I feel this. I am so sorry.
Mallorie walked into that lunch expecting Rasit to be exposed. Instead, Brandon looked across the table, ignored the argument she had carefully prepared, and asked one question that changed the entire power balance. Did Rasit even know Brandon was going to be there? That was the moment everything shifted. Up until then, Mallorie believed she controlled the story. Rasit was jealous. Rasit was defensive. Rasit was the one refusing to compromise. Brandon had already clashed with him, so Mallorie expected this meeting to end with two people finally telling Rasit exactly what was wrong with him. But Brandon did not follow the plan. He calmly said Mallorie was leaving out important context. Rasit looked stunned. Mallorie looked blindsided. And what was supposed to be a confrontation against Rasit suddenly became an examination of how Mallorie had arranged the entire situation. The relationship dynamics inside the situation raised some very real questions. Was Mallorie trying to solve a problem? Or was she trying to create a moment she could control? Why would Brandon, someone who had every reason to distrust Rasit, suddenly defend him? What did Mallorie allegedly say before filming that made Brandon question her version of events? And how did one lunch create rumors that TLC might be reconsidering Mallorie's future? Because this was never just about Brandon switching sides. It was about the possibility that Mallorie had been controlling which details everyone heard, who was allowed to speak, and how every conflict was interpreted. She believed Rasit was about to be judged. She did not realize everyone had started watching her. On the surface, the lunch looked like an attempt to clear the air. 3 people sit down, talk through their problems, and hopefully leave with fewer reasons to hate each other. But the moment Rasit arrived, it was obvious he did not feel like he was entering a peaceful conversation. He looked guarded. He was already expecting criticism. He believed Brandon had judged him before they even sat down, and that assumption made every word feel heavier. Brandon, meanwhile, was unusually calm. He was not arguing. He was not trying to prove a point. He was listening, and that silence made the room more tense because nobody knew what he was thinking. Mallorie began presenting her case. She brought up Rasit's jealousy toward Brandon. She returned to the baseball game tension. She mentioned the prenup conflict and the way Rasit becomes cold when he feels challenged. She described his distrust as if it existed on its own, without any connection to what had happened before. And for a few minutes, Brandon let her speak. Mallorie seemed to take that silence as agreement. The more he listened, the more confident she became. She believed he was waiting for his moment to confirm everything she had already said. But Brandon was not preparing to support her. He was studying the pattern. He watched who controlled the pace. He noticed who answered questions that were directed at somebody else. He listened for the details Mallorie emphasized and the details she skipped. Then came the question, did Rasit know I would be here? That question sounds small until you understand what it does to the entire story. If Rasit knew Brandon would be attending, then his guarded behavior could look like another example of jealousy. But if he was surprised by Brandon's presence, the same behavior could also look like a response to feeling cornered. That does not excuse bad behavior. Rasit is still responsible for what he says, how he reacts, and whether he turns discomfort into hostility. Feeling ambushed does not give anyone permission to become cruel, disrespectful, or controlling. But context matters. And Brandon's point was that Mallorie seemed to want everyone to judge the reaction without examining the setup. That is where this storyline becomes much deeper than a basic argument. A lot of unhealthy couples are not only fighting about what happened, they are fighting over who gets to define what happened. Mallorie's version depends on people beginning at the end. Rasit becomes upset, so Rasit must be the problem. He becomes defensive, so he must be hiding something. He goes quiet or cold, so that proves he does not care. But Brandon begins looking backward. What happened before Rasit became upset? What information did he have? What information was kept from him? Was he surprised in front of other people? Was he pushed after already feeling uncomfortable? And once he reacted, was that reaction used to prove the conclusion Mallorie had reached before the conversation even began? That creates a dangerous relationship pattern. One person controls the setup. The other person gets judged for the response. Again, none of this makes Rasit innocent. If he becomes jealous, suspicious, emotionally punishing, or controlling, that responsibility still belongs to him. Brandon is not erasing Rasit's red flags. What he is challenging is the idea that Mallory has no role in the cycle. That distinction makes his defense stronger. If Brandon had suddenly announced that Rasit was perfect, viewers would reject it immediately. The tension between Rasit and Brandon already existed. Brandon had already seen behavior he disliked. Instead, his position is more believable. Rasit has issues. Mallory may also know how to trigger those issues, then use the reaction to avoid examining her own choices. That is not forgiveness. That is context. And Mallory's first major contradiction appears right there. She says she wants communication, but she allegedly brings Rasit into a meeting without giving him all the information. She says she wants honesty, but she expects Brandon to support a version of events that has already been prepared. She says she wants accountability, but when Brandon turns that accountability toward her, she feels betrayed. The problem is not that Mallory wants Rasit challenged. Partners sometimes need to hear uncomfortable truths. The problem is whether she wants a real conversation or a controlled conclusion. That question becomes more serious when Brandon reveals what Mallory allegedly told him before the lunch. Mallory did not simply invite Brandon and ask him to speak honestly. She allegedly gave him a role. She wanted him to bring up Rasit's insecurity. She wanted him to mention the prenup. She wanted him to question whether Rasit loved her or simply wanted control over her. She wanted him to push hard enough that Rasit would finally admit he was jealous of Brandon. And that completely changes the purpose of the meeting. A conversation designed to create understanding leaves room for surprise. People are allowed to explain themselves. New information can change the direction. A confrontation designed to produce a reaction is different. The goal is no longer understanding. The goal is confirmation. Brandon begins to suspect Mallory does not want him to listen. She wants him to help create a moment. She wants Rasit to lose his composure in front of someone who already distrusts him. Then his reaction can become the evidence. See? This is exactly what I have been dealing with. That is what makes a setup like this so powerful. The person being challenged can barely win. If Rasit reacts emotionally, Mallory can say he proved her point. If he stays quiet, she can say he is cold and refuses to communicate. If he tries to explain, she can say he is twisting the story. Every possible response can be turned into proof against him. And that is the moment Brandon seems to realize he is not being invited as a neutral voice. He is being asked to become pressure. His reaction is not loud. That matters. He does not stand up and give a dramatic speech about Mallory being wrong. He simply explains that he came to settle the tension, but the more Mallory told him what to say, the more uncomfortable he became. That is one of the clearest red flags in the entire storyline. Support is not obedience. A friend can believe you are hurting and still refuse to attack your partner for you. A friend can understand your frustration and still disagree with how you handled it. The moment Mallory expects Brandon to repeat her talking points instead of forming his own opinion, she is no longer asking for emotional support. She is asking for control. And Rasit's response makes the scene even more revealing. He does not celebrate. He does not smile because Brandon embarrassed Mallory. He does not use the moment to attack her. He quietly asks whether she ever planned to listen to him. That question carries more emotional weight than another shouting match ever could, because it suggests Rasit's biggest fear is not simply that Brandon dislikes him. His fear is that Mallory has already decided what every disagreement means before he is allowed to speak. If that is how he experiences the relationship, then every conflict becomes hopeless. He is not entering conversations to solve problems. He is entering conversations to defend himself against a conclusion that already exists. But viewers would still be deeply divided here. Some fans would probably say Brandon's intervention was overdue. They would argue that somebody finally noticed the difference between holding Rasit accountable and publicly cornering him. A section of the audience would likely believe Mallory had been using Brandon as a weapon because she could not get Rasit to agree with her on her own. Other viewers would remain skeptical. They would say Brandon defending Rasit once does not erase everything Rasit has done. They would point out that jealousy, emotional withdrawal, and distrust do not become acceptable just because Mallory handled one conversation badly. And many viewers would probably fall somewhere between those positions. Mallory may have valid concerns. Rasit may have serious issues. But if Mallory presents those concerns through surprise confrontations and controlled conversations, she makes her own case harder to trust. That is why this storyline works. Nobody has to be completely innocent for somebody else to cross a line. Then the situation moves away from the table, and the relationship conflict becomes something much bigger. Mallorie becomes so uncomfortable with Brandon's comments that she allegedly attempts to end filming. She leaves the table and confronts production away from both men. She believes Brandon has blindsided her. She feels as though the story is turning against her before the conversation is even finished. Emotionally, that reaction is understandable. Imagine walking into a filmed lunch believing someone is there to support you. You have discussed the problem in advance. You think everyone finally understands what you have been dealing with. Then that person begins questioning you. It would feel humiliating. But feeling blindsided does not automatically mean production created the betrayal. A producer tells Mallorie that Brandon was speaking for himself. Nobody instructed him to defend Rasit. That answer makes everything worse because it removes the easiest explanation. Mallorie cannot simply blame editing. She cannot accuse production of secretly writing Brandon's response. She has to face the possibility that Brandon listened to her, watched the conversation, and independently decided she was not telling the full story. That is a much more personal rejection. Mallorie allegedly wants parts of Brandon's comments removed. She does not want the private conversation discussed. She wants more attention placed on Rasit's previous behavior. She wants production to explain her intentions so viewers understand why she brought Brandon into the meeting. Some of those concerns are reasonable. Reality cast members know editing can shape public perception. A complicated person can be reduced to one reaction. A painful situation can be compressed into a few minutes that make somebody look completely different. Wanting context does not automatically make Mallorie controlling. But asking for context is not the same as deciding which other cast members are allowed to speak. That is where the production problem begins. The issue is not that Mallorie became upset. Emotional conflict is part of reality television. Producers do not remove people simply because they cry, argue, or feel betrayed. The concern is that Mallorie allegedly threatens to stop participating unless the direction changes. If she refuses follow-up interviews, cancels scheduled filming, or demands that uncomfortable comments be removed, production is no longer dealing only with relationship drama. It is dealing with cooperation. And that is where the firing rumor starts to make sense. Did TLC officially fire Mallorie in this story? No confirmed firing has been announced. What exists is uncertainty. A central cast member may be refusing to continue unless she has more control over the storyline. Production now has to decide whether it can keep following the relationship if one of its central people will only participate under certain conditions. That gives production several possible choices. They can continue filming and allow the conflict to unfold naturally. They can reduce Mallorie's role and focus more heavily on Rasit and Brandon. Or they can end her participation if she refuses to cooperate. The title asks whether TLC fired Mallorie because that is the most dramatic version of the question. But the deeper issue is not a single firing call. It is how quickly someone's position can become unstable when a personal conflict turns into a fight over the production itself. Reality television protects the story. It does not always protect the person who believes the story belongs to them. And just when it looks like Brandon has become Rasit's unexpected ally, another layer appears. Brandon's decision is not completely selfless. He does not suddenly trust Rasit. He still sees behavior he considers immature. He still dislikes the jealousy and hostility. He still questions whether Rasit is ready for a stable relationship. But Brandon has his own frustration with Mallorie. He feels she pulls him into her relationship whenever she needs pressure placed on Rasit. She wants Brandon involved when he supports her. But when he forms an opinion she dislikes, she treats that independence as betrayal. That means Brandon may not be defending Rasit because Rasit earned his friendship. He may be refusing to let Mallorie use him. That is a very different motivation. Brandon tells Rasit that one moment of support does not erase their past conflict. That line is important because it stops the story from becoming too simple. He is not saying, "You were right about everything." He is saying, "You are being cornered in this moment." Rasit answers that Brandon does not need to like him. He only needed someone to acknowledge what was happening. That exchange gives their temporary alliance some emotional credibility. Neither man pretends they are suddenly close. Neither man forgets the damage between them. They simply recognize that fairness can exist even without friendship. But that fragile understanding becomes much more threatening to Mallorie when Rasit begins sharing what she allegedly said about Brandon in private. Rasit claims Mallorie described Brandon as intrusive, jealous, and too involved in her life. Yet whenever she fought with Rasit, she used Brandon's opinion as evidence that Rasit was wrong. That creates a question Mallory cannot easily answer. If Brandon is untrustworthy when he challenges Mallory, why is he trustworthy when he criticizes Rasit? If Brandon is too involved in their relationship, why does Mallory keep inviting him into their most private conflicts? If she believes Brandon wants them to fail, why does she expect Rasit to respect his judgment? Brandon's credibility appears to change depending on whether he is helping Mallory. When he challenges Rasit, he is wise. When he challenges Mallory, he is manipulated. When he warns about the relationship, Rasit should listen. When he questions Mallory's methods, he has crossed a boundary. That contradiction damages her position more than any single accusation. Then Rasit reveals another alleged detail. Mallory allegedly told him that Brandon wanted their relationship to fail. She made Brandon sound like an outside threat who could not accept that she had chosen Rasit. If that is true, why keep bringing Brandon closer? The answer may be that Mallory benefited from keeping the two men suspicious of each other. As long as Brandon believed Rasit was controlling, Brandon would defend Mallory. As long as Rasit believed Brandon wanted the relationship to fail, Rasit would see Brandon as the enemy. Mallory remained in the center, controlling the information moving between them. Neither man compared what he had been told. Neither man recognized that both were being described as the problem. And that is why the lunch becomes so dangerous for Mallory. Brandon and Rasit stop competing. They start comparing. In many unhealthy triangles, the person in the middle maintains power because the other two people never communicate directly. Each person receives a different version. Each believes the other is responsible for the tension. Once they speak openly, the contradictions become visible. Brandon looks more hurt than angry because he realizes Mallory may have been telling each man whatever kept him useful. Rasit was useful as the boyfriend who constantly had to prove his loyalty. Brandon was useful as the outside voice who could pressure Rasit. But once Brandon stopped playing that role, Mallory lost control of the triangle. That is when the production meeting becomes critical. Mallory attends believing she can finally explain herself without Brandon and Rasit interrupting. She argues that editing and pressure have made her look controlling. She says the two men are joining forces because neither wants to accept responsibility for his own behavior. And honestly, that argument may contain some truth. Rasit has reasons to redirect attention away from his jealousy. Brandon has reasons to avoid admitting how involved he has become in a relationship that is not his. Mallory may genuinely feel they are using her as the common enemy because it is easier than looking at themselves. That is why the analysis should remain fair. Mallory does not have to be lying about everything for her methods to be wrong. Rasit does not have to be innocent for him to be ambushed. Brandon does not have to be completely objective for his observations to matter. Production asks Mallory direct questions. Did she ask Brandon to confront Rasit? Did she hide Brandon's attendance? Did she tell each man negative things about the other? Did she refuse filming because she disliked where the conversation went? Mallory gives emotional answers, but not always clear ones. She says her intentions were misunderstood. She wanted Brandon and Rasit to settle their differences. Then she admits she hoped Brandon would make Rasit understand how serious the situation had become. And that admission creates another contradiction. She says she wanted peace, but she expected pressure. She says she wanted communication, but she allegedly warned Brandon that Rasit would twist the story if he was allowed to explain. She says she wanted resolution, but the only acceptable resolution seems to be Rasit agreeing with her version. This is where intention and impact collide. Mallory may not have entered the lunch thinking, I am going to humiliate Rasit. She may have believed, I need somebody to help him understand. But if the method involves surprising him, bringing in someone he distrusts, and preparing that pee,